Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to whichever Pinkin channel this happens to find you on. Connor Southwell, joined by Dave Freezer and Paddy Davitt. Just reacting to the news, which has dropped in about probably the last half an hour or so. Reports this afternoon saying that Frank Lampard is set to be unveiled as the new Norwich City head coach. Pad, I think it's probably fair to actually let's start with probably where we are with this, because that's what a lot of people will want to know. So these reports which have come from TalkSport this afternoon, just give us sort of your understanding on where we are with Frank Lampard becoming Norwich City's next head coach.
Before I get into that, Connor, blue is the colour, which I know is not a popular colour in this part of East Anglia, but given Frank Lampard's connections, I think it's fairly appropriate. I must have known when I woke up this morning that we were going to be at this point at 20 to 4 on a Thursday afternoon. 20 to
3. You've added an hour there.
No, yeah. I'm hoping we're pulling in the European audience as well. Continental Europe. Maybe somebody in Norway as well who was heavily linked, but doesn't look like it's going to go in that direction. Yeah, as we stand, funnily enough, I was in dialogue with the club just almost at the immediate point that TalkSport tweet dropped. And they were sort of talking me through the timescale of when an announcement would be made. And then, of course, all hell breaks loose. I said, get ready, you're in for a deluge. And they reiterated that nothing is done yet. There is no contracts exchanged. Frank Lampard, as we sit here, is not Norwich's new head coach, but it's looking increasingly likely he will be. I think there's a bit of to and fro, and you found something there on social before we came online that maybe around the backroom team, which was, funny enough, what was told to me at the start of the week, that there was discussions ongoing around the makeup of potential candidates, backroom teams. If that's where we are now, then that might explain why it's not probably going to be weekend/Monday, was what I was told most recently. More likely for the actual official announcement. Now, that might get slightly brought forward now as this has come out, but nothing will be announced until all the I's and the T's are dotted and crossed, and we're not there yet. So, understandably, the club are reticent to sort of confirm anything or even really acknowledge those type of reports that are out there. But I think it's safe to say that Frank Lampard looks like he's in pole position, and barring an 11th hour kink in the road, then he will be Norwich's new head coach, and wait for the fun and games to begin thereafter.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating appointment for several reasons. As Paddy says, very keen to stress it's not been done yet, and there's still work to do before we get to that point. Dave, I'm going to come to you for kind of your initial reaction on this, because Frank Lampard's a massive name in football. He's led the kind of bookmakers' odds for this job ever since Daniel Farke was sacked last Saturday. Just kind of give us your initial reaction to this news. I guess probably not a surprise that it's reports with Frank Lampard, but I guess the element of surprise comes around people suggesting that this doesn't really feel like a Norwich City appointment, I suppose.
It does feel like a little bit of a lurch in the other direction, doesn't it? But they are bottom of the Premier League. They have only won one of their 11 games. So, frankly, that may, no pun intended, may be what they need. Lampard has got 106 caps for England, Premier League legend, Chelsea's all-time scorer, all those sort of things. He was an absolutely fantastic player. I was very surprised he didn't take the England under-21 job. I thought that was absolutely tailor-made for him. And then Lee Carsley ended up taking it. And there were plenty of reports that Lampard would take that. And he seems quite similar to Gareth Southgate in his demeanour and his personality and the way he'd sort of fit the FA mould. I thought that was a bit of a shoo-in and was surprised when that then didn't happen. But he clearly wants another taste of Premier League action, because it started off quite well for him, didn't it, at Chelsea? And then it tailed off quite severely, and he sort of lost the thread of it. Derby, he did a reasonable job there. It was a start, and we all know that Derby is a bit of it's a bit of mad as a box of frogs, really, that club, isn't it? So he actually probably was holding back the tide to a certain extent. I've seen some quite spiteful coverage, actually, from the Derby end, from the Derby fans. Been quite, I'd say maybe a bit OTT in terms of evaluating what he did there and the transfer work and things like that. But in the here and now for Norwich City, it feels like he is somebody who could inspire the squad, who could drag that another 10% out of them. When they turn up for training, whenever that may be, Tuesday, Wednesday, possibly later than that for some of the international boys, it's not, oh, here's this chap from Norway or Sweden or Holland that you've not really heard of before, that you've now got to shoot off on your phone and find out about. It's Frank Lampard. You know exactly who he is. You know exactly what he's about. Now it's about learning what he's been learning since he's been out of the game at Chelsea, which isn't that long, is it? Was it December that he left Chelsea when Tuchel came in? So you would have thought that someone with his profile, he would have been busy. He wouldn't have just been sat on his backside, will he? He would have been wanting to go to other clubs. He's got good relations at Manchester City, for instance, doesn't he? You would have thought that maybe he spent a bit of time with Guardiola. I'm speculating, obviously. But he's a big name. He comes with big profile. As we're all about to find out, it's going to bring the Premier League circus to town already, isn't it? If it's not already here, in various different elements. And it'll be fascinating to see if it works out, if they do get it over the line and if they get it all confirmed. But it's felt to be heading that way all week, really, hasn't it? And now it looks to have taken a big step towards actually getting done, if they can get all the backroom team and all the final bits and pieces done. And then if it gets the tick and we all get that tweet drop through from Norwich City to confirm that they've got a new head coach, then it's going to be incredibly interesting to see what Frank Lampard does with this difficult situation.
We'll speak about Frank Lampard as a coach in just a moment, Pad. But there was an interesting line in the release that Norwich put out last week announcing Daniel Farke had left, from Stuart Webers, saying that the decision was made to remind people of their determination to stay in the Premier League. And it's been really interesting to see how people have viewed Eddie Howe's appointment at Newcastle compared to maybe how they're comparing a potential appointment at Norwich City, i.e. most feel that Eddie Howe is in a survival race, I suppose, and many feel that Norwich City are doomed, when in reality there's not really much between the two teams at all. It's certainly not in terms of points. Norwich, of course, have now won a game. Newcastle yet to do that, which is interesting from a perception perspective. But what Frank Lampard's appointment, if it is to be him, would do is just remind everyone of Norwich City's intentions this season, wouldn't it?
A little bit more than that, Connor. Yeah, I mean, for reasons Dave's mapped out, this is. Let me click back. Has there been a higher profile appointment for Norwich manager or coach? I don't think there has, off the top of my head. So, that's the level they've now, and you can be sure that the focus will shift. It won't be little old Norwich, as I've seen, pointed out on social. That there will be an intention with this appointment to signal quite irrefutably, following on from Stuart's comments pre-Leeds, that we're not doomed. We don't think we're gone already and we're raising the white flag. They believe it is still possible. And when you go and make an appointment, yet to be confirmed, but when you make an appointment of the nature of Frank Lampard, you're very clearly sending a signal you don't think it's game over, because otherwise you'd be already maybe not publicly messaging as such, but looking towards the what next, the Championship, and looking to rebuild and come back again. There's no trace of this with Frank Lampard. What I would say, for all the glittering CV he brings, management-wise, he is relatively inexperienced, and what he certainly doesn't have as a player or as a coach is experience of this, which Eddie Howe does, of course, which is wrong end of the table, scrapping for points, scrapping for survival. So that's my biggest question mark about this appointment, not necessarily about his relative lack of inexperience. I think he'll buy into the cultural element of playing young players. He did that both at Derby, where he actually got some Chelsea players, Mason Mount, notable among them, Tamori as well, the centre-back, and then continued that on when he went into Chelsea, notably with Billy Gilmour, which I'm sure we'll get into in due course, what this means for Billy Gilmour. But those issues I don't have any problem with. But I just fear, if there is going to be a negative, and how it might play out in the next few days if it's confirmed, is what does he know about getting a team out of trouble at the wrong end of the table? But ultimately, Norwich and Stuart Webber will have weighed the pros and cons, and they feel that, for the point they've made, which I think is very pertinent, when he walks into Colney, if it's to be Tuesday morning, and whoever's in the change room at that point, and when the internationals all filter back, can you imagine if you're Grant Hanley or if you're Andrew Omobamidele, both ends of the spectrum, you see Frank Lampard in front of you, instantly there's a respect level, because he has achieved more than any of those players in that dressing room. So instantly you are going to listen to what this guy has got to say about football. And that, hopefully, in the short term, when it needs to happen, Southampton, Wolves, Newcastle, might tip the balance, because he's not obviously going to be able to impart, him and his coaches, his philosophy and his coaching priorities in the space of 3 or 4 games. But what he might do, by weight of his personality and his reputation in the game and his standing in the game, is inspire that group of players to perform at the level they need to pick up points in these next 3. Because if they do that, then immediately he gets players on side, he gets a fan base on side, and he injects belief into fans and players that, yes, this is possible. So I can see immediately a Frank Lampard appointment is there to, in the interim, get that immediate reaction. Mid to longer term, we'll see. But obviously, if he gets them up and running, then you get a bit of momentum behind you, and then it's a lot easier. So, a real fascinating new era under Stuart Webber for me. This is a completely new dawn, and certainly when you bring in a Frank Lampard, you're not really talking about culture, philosophy, building for the mid to long term. It does, to chime with the statement that came out Saturday night, very much smack of, we need to stay in this division, and we think he's the best man for the job.
Yeah, Dave, I was going to come to you because we'll dissect Frank Lampard as a coach in a second, but just from Stuart Webber's perspective, because as we said all week really on Frank Lampard, this feels like quite a lurch, doesn't it, away from what Stuart Webber has done before. Maybe that's representative of where Norwich City are at the moment. Do you feel that as well? I've seen already someone on Twitter describe it as kind of Stuart Webber's football midlife crisis, so to speak, at any appointment of Frank Lampard. Is that kind of a fair reflection of where you see it, or does it just show maybe where Norwich City are now?
Well, I think Stuart's only 4 years older than me, so I won't go along with that. But I get the joke. I suppose because Stuart's still so early in his career, really, as a sporting director, it was only 2015 was it that he became, well, it was slightly different at Huddersfield, wasn't it? Head of football operations, I think was actually his title, wasn't it? And then he became sporting director at Norwich. So he is still obviously relatively young for such a senior role in football, and he's got a lot of years ahead of him. And we know about his ambition, and it doesn't necessarily just stick to football, does it? And not to just this country. We all know that he's a big Formula One fan, for instance. So that he's got a long list of things that he wants to achieve with his life, but he's at something of a tipping point, isn't he? And so in Norwich City, maybe there was just getting too tied up in the project and the philosophy and the whole self-funded stuff, which everyone has got a bit. Well, I know. I think a large chunk of fans have got sick of hearing about at the moment, haven't they? Because the only thing that matters this season, yes, all that philosophy and stuff has to stay in place. Everybody wants it to, or the vast majority of people do. That's Stuart's job. He has to keep that overarching thing going, doesn't he? But the head coach, his job is to get Premier League survival this season. And the mistake that Daniel seemed to make with a lot of people was not giving off enough of an air of rebellion almost, and of being brave enough to go to these big clubs and upset them and go out and puff their chests out that little bit more and say, no, we belong in the Premier League. And as Pad mentioned there, getting rid of that little old Norwich mentality, because everything that Delia and Michael have built towards, without getting too grand here, I recently wrote that piece about that it's going to be 25 years since they first became directors. Very soon, in a couple of weeks' time, it'll be the anniversary of when Delia and Michael first joined the board. For all the good things that they've done, there's obviously been bad things along the way as well. But generally, this last decade or so, they've made some pretty incredible progress on the whole. It's been a roller coaster. There's been ups and downs. But if there's to reach a point where this self-funded model really is started to be appreciated by people outside of Norfolk, and it's actually going to be a success in terms of the English game, then you have to start surviving in the Premier League. Because Norwich City were, before they were relegated in the mid-90s, I think it was 23 of the last 25 seasons were in the top flight of English football. I know football has changed drastically since then, but that shows that Norwich didn't have loads of money in those days either. That Manchester United, the big clubs, still were able to spend a lot more than Norwich City were then, and they punched above their weight. So ultimately, if they could just somehow, by hook or by crook, whether it's Frank Lampard coming in and just empowering the players and inspiring them enough to get wins on the board and play some attacking football, you would have thought. I can't see Lampard turning up and parking the bus. And achieve survival this year, then that is going to be an incredible story and almost changes the entire direction that the club would go in. Then you can start to think about expanding the stadium and doing all those next things that they want to do. So the philosophy, that's Stuart Webber's job to keep that going. That's the staff's job to keep that going. The head coach, it's the here and now. It's this season. It's the next match. And it's about getting as many wins on the board as possible to do everything that you can to keep Norwich in the Premier League.
Absolutely. And for all that we've spoken about, Pad, as Frank Lampard, the player, and his reputation and what it will do for Norwich City standing from perhaps a media perspective, there's still a coach underneath all of this that we need to talk about, and a coach who has only managed nearly 150 games, has had 2 managerial jobs, one very, very high profile one, which didn't work out, certainly in his second season at Chelsea. I mean, I think every Norwich City supporter, anyone who follows Norwich City, knew that whichever or whoever this appointment was going to be would be a risk at some level. Why do you think they've decided that Frank Lampard is the best risk, or the risk that is most worth taking at this stage?
Well, before I get into that, I've just had a scroll down social media, and I think the best one I've seen so far is, can he play in midfield still? Because if he could, he'd definitely do a job in the Norwich midfield. There's no doubt about it. They need a bit of creativity and drive from the box. Dare I say, Johnny Howson-esque. I think he's been a bit harshly treated in terms of almost that, look at his coaching career. What has he done? He hasn't really deserved anything to, show him any sort of plaudits, because ultimately, you look at the job he did at Derby and look at the state of that football club now. Here is a guy who took them to a Championship playoff final, and we all know from Norwich experience how difficult that is. I think they beat Leeds in the semi-final, if I remember that year, which was no mean feat. So that tells me him and Jody Morris was his right-hand man on that occasion, that they were able to, over the entire course of a Championship season, meld a group of players to, as I say, get top 6 and then get them to Wembley. Obviously, they fell at the final hurdle, but still, that isn't an inconsiderable achievement. There's not many coaches who will have been able to take teams to Championship playoff finals. He did it in his first or second season, I think. And then even the Chelsea experience, don't forget he was under a transfer embargo. So it wasn't as if, you think of Chelsea now and you look at the last window, Thomas Tuchel can go and spend 100 million or whatever, or Chelsea as a club can on Romelu Lukaku and massive amounts of, flexing muscles. He wasn't able to do that, I'm pretty sure, for most of his tenure at Chelsea. Certainly the majority of the windows he was in charge of. He had to work with young players. Incredibly difficult for a club with Chelsea's stature and expectations, because they, as has been shown now, are expected to be competing at the top end of the tree in Europe and domestically. But worth reiterating, he got into an FA Cup final, again, fell at the final hurdle. I think Arsenal beat him at Wembley, and also got him in the top 4 and qualified for the Champions League. So, I don't think that's a bad body of coaching work for a man who is, like you say, relatively inexperienced. He isn't some raw novice who is trading on his playing reputation, who's now hypothetically still, we have to keep reiterating, but being parachuted into Carrow Road, and we just don't know, because we've seen that too often in the past, not so much Norwich, but certainly a lot of clubs where a player's reputation has got him through the door, and then it's been palpably shown that they're not ready to become a coach. I think he's got enough on his CV as a coach that, there's a reasons for optimism. Ultimately, again, I go back to what I said earlier, my concern is he doesn't really know what it's about at the bottom end of the Premier League, when there's so much pressure, there's so much, every game feels exponentially bigger than the last, and particularly when he's going to inherit a team who are, rock bottom with 5 points from 11 games. He's already, up against, quite a tough spot. So that's my concern. But certainly as a coach, I think, the times Norwich came up against his Derby teams, they were always very difficult. Of course, the infamous floodlight game that they won at Carrow Road, but even I remember the away game that season, the teams and the way he set his teams up, was not that hugely dissimilar from how Daniel was setting his teams up in the Championship. So, and Jody Morris, if it is to be him, comes with a reputation as a very, very good progressive coach. And I'm sure the rest of his backroom team, when it's unveiled, there will be plenty of nous in their experience and coaching ability. So, the more I talk about it, the more, once you get past the initial kind of shock factor of it's Frank Lampard coming to Norwich, you begin to see maybe why Stuart and Neil Adams, his assistant, and the board feel that maybe this is the right way to go. And another comment I'll just finish with on social media. This is a free hit now. You know, they were probably already going down. They may well still go down. You know, he might not be able to change it around, but if by dropping Frank Lampard into the equation, it just triggers something and gets maybe them playing in a more progressive manner and attacking wise as well, with a bit more freedom and energy and endeavour to their attacking play, then who knows? You just don't know. I mean, they're not cut adrift to the extent where you think it's a complete forlorn task. You know, there's still, with the games coming up, more than enough potential, you know, to get themselves firmly in contention to stay up. So that's probably how we have to look at it, you know, and what comes thereafter when the dust settles and we get to May next summer, and depending on where Norwich are in terms of their league status, then you can reassess as a club. But in the here and now, this is very much Frank Lampard come in, spark us, and try and keep this team in the division against the odds, it must be said.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be interesting, I think. And as Pad said there, Dave, I mean, he kind of tipped it as a bit of a free hit. Do you see that as kind of for both parties? It's a free hit for Lampard and where he is currently in his managerial career after, obviously, the way it fell out at Chelsea, even though he's taken probably a lot of credit for how he developed that Chelsea side that Thomas Tuchel then took on to win the Champions League. Do you see it as a free hit for him and for Norwich, given many people outside of Norfolk, possibly even some within now, are probably resigned to them heading back to the Championship? What's kind of your view on that?
No, not really. No, I mean, 5 points adrift as we stand. I know that things haven't been going particularly well, but I think for Lampard, he really needs to make some degree of success of this. A lot was said after the Chelsea game, really, wasn't it? That if Norwich get relegated from the Premier League, we can all handle it, I think. And I think most supporters can handle it, as long as they're competitive, as long as they're fighting, as long as they are in the mix. If they can't manage to stay up, then it hurts, but it's not the end of the world. We all know that Norwich generally have a bit more fun in the Championship anyway. We know that they'll probably come back up and have another crack at it, and hopefully one day would do it. But to think that 11 games into the season was why everyone got so wound up, wasn't it? That Daniel was overseeing a real downturn to the point where they were basically hopeless. They were almost dead in the water, weren't they? And everyone was saying, well, this can't be allowed to continue. You've got to do something to make them competitive. And obviously that is what Stuart's trying to do. But I think from Lampard's point of view as well, from everything that we've just said here, the jury is out, isn't it? If he wants to be a top coach, if he wants to be like his old buddy Steven Gerrard / rival Steven Gerrard, then and be able to get the Villa job, which will have been a job that they all wanted because there's a load of money to spend. I know they're not quite Newcastle level, but Villa have got plenty of money, haven't they? And they are ambitious owners. They do want to get towards Europe and things like that. But Lampard wasn't really, I know he was in the odds, wasn't he? But I don't think he was ever a serious contender for the Villa job, really. He's popped up in the Rangers odds as well today, hasn't he? So I guess there's probably going to be a little bit of interest from up there as well, but couldn't really see him wanting to step into Gerrard's boots, given the way that they've always had that sort of, they have always been tied together, haven't they? In terms of people always being so frustrated how it never worked for England. It should have been the golden generation, shouldn't it? It should have been with Rio and Michael Owen and all that sort of stuff in 2002. And it never really worked with Lampard and Gerrard. So no, I wouldn't want to see the words free hit put to it, because I think it's too important for that. I think for him, if he wants to go and be a top coach, if he ever wants to get back towards the Champions League and things like that, this is game time for him. He's got to make a success of this. And for Norwich, they need to, at least at the absolute bare minimum, show that they're competitive. And from some of the earlier things that we've said here earlier, again, like Paddy was saying, really, the more you talk about it, the more you think that about the sense it makes in terms of the way that Lampard would probably prefer to play attacking football, and that is the way the recruitment still went, wasn't it? That they still have a pretty attacking squad. They, as we all know, they're kind of missing that Tete or Skip, the proper muscly central defensive midfielder type player. So we shall see. I'll bounce one back to you, Connor. Billy Gilmour. He's obviously a man that we've spoken about a lot. I've seen all the gifs going around straight away. Him walking in the Conor McGregor walking style as he comes back into the dressing room and all that sort of thing. That's going to be really fascinating to see what difference that makes to Gilmour, isn't it?
Yeah, he's going to be delighted. I think this is the man who gave him his debut at Chelsea, didn't he? So, I mean, their relationship is very good. We've obviously carried the Lampard quotes before on what a talent Billy is, and yeah, it's now going to be about I think Billy Gilmour and I suppose Matthias Norman maybe is a midfield 2 or a 3 if he goes in the way which he has done of a 4-3-3. But I think we have to look at Billy Gilmour now becoming a very serious part of Norwich City's midfield again. Obviously, we haven't seen too much of him in kind of the final weeks of Daniel Farke's reign. I suspect we'll be seeing him a lot more if Frank Lampard is to be confirmed in the days ahead. Pad, we've spoken about why Norwich might be attracted to Frank Lampard. Why do you think Frank Lampard would be attracted to Norwich City in their current predicament? As we've said all week, this is not an easy job for anyone to step into. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be, as we said earlier, many people have already written them off. What is it about Norwich City that you think is appealing to Frank Lampard?
Well, a few things I would have thought. I mean, first and foremost, we have to keep reiterating Norwich aren't on loan to the Premier League from the Championship and are already down. You know, we're 11 games in, and he will back himself in the remaining 27 that he can get the points on the board to remain a Premier League club and by definition a Premier League head coach. So, you know, that's a good sign as well. If you're Frank Lampard, that he fancies the challenge. He doesn't think it's, as I say, the impossible job. I'd also say on another level, you know, that just again having a look on social media, he's clearly wanted to get back in since, you know, I think it was January that he was moved on from Chelsea. Without knowing, I'm pretty sure he'll have put his hat in the ring for numerous jobs at Premier League level, and it hasn't happened. So ultimately, you get to a point where you need to get back in. You if you're out of the game for too long, and he did a lot of punditry work in the past. He was doing it again around England games in the Euros. You don't really probably want to, if you feel that your talents now lie on the coaching field and as a manager, then you want an opportunity. And I'll go back to what Daniel said just towards the end of his reign. There's only 20 jobs in the Premier League. It is maybe not in everybody's opinion, but it is the most high profile league in the world. It's the richest league in the world, and those 20 jobs are probably the most coveted coaching jobs in the world, because you're working with the best players. You were up against your contemporaries, Klopps, Guardiolas, these Tuchel, these top draw, and it's not that often, although it feels at the minute with Villa, making changes, and Newcastle and Tottenham not that long ago, it feels a bit of a merry-go-round. But I think the reality is Premier League jobs don't come around all that often over the entire piece of a season. So, if there is an opportunity for him to get back in as a Premier League manager, why wouldn't he take it? But I think the only other thing I'd say is, and again, I think it is right to kind of park maybe this, we're Norwich, we're not defined by what happens on a Saturday or a Tuesday now. We're building this cultural vision and this mid to long-term thing, and we're not buffeted by short-termism, whether that's in results or the reactions of fans or whatever, media, pundits. If you park that for one moment, that is true, and it clearly is about the Premier League now. But also, I think it might have been his uncle, actually, Harry Redknapp, did a bit on TalkSport yesterday or the day before, and he said Norwich have got good owners. They've got a philosophy where they give managers, coaches time. They're not of the knee-jerk variety necessarily, and I think that is borne out more or less. If you look under Michael and Delia, managers have been given time. In some cases, you may argue too much time. Certainly, certain fans would have argued that Chris Hughton immediately springs to mind. He probably the change could have been made there. Even Alex Neil, they limped on with him for 4 or 5 months, didn't they, when it looked pretty forlorn. But if you're a head coach and you're looking at it, you're going to get time to embed what you want to embed, and it isn't going to be, I'll lose the first 3 games, I'm immediately on the back foot and under pressure. That's quite an attractive proposition for a head coach. And of course, working with somebody like Stuart Webber, who is a very progressive, embracing new ideas all the time. You see what's happened at Colney. You see, £750,000 sort of total investment in technology like the soccer bot. All of those things. The complete transformation of Colney, the desire to even further move that on and add even more elements to the training ground to be like best in class, to be almost world class facilities. All of that for a young head coach who clearly has desires maybe to sort of operate at the top end of the game. I think right here, right now, for him in his situation, having been out of the game for nearly a year, it's not a bad fit. It looks, from his point of view, like an environment where he could maybe flourish again as a head coach, and ultimately, let's be brutally honest about it, probably move on to pastures new. Because ultimately, if you're Frank Lampard, when you came into management, I don't think you probably felt necessarily that Norwich was the extent, of your coaching ambitions, and that's not being derogatory to Norwich. That's just, he is Frank Lampard, and maybe the Chelsea opportunity was too good to turn down, but maybe it was too soon for him, and now he needs to reset. And the fact that he was happy to start at Derby as well, that tells you he isn't necessarily of the opinion that I'm too big for X, Y, or Z club. He knows he's got to cut his teeth and learn his trade as a coach, and he did that at Derby. And as I say, Chelsea, in the end, maybe he wasn't hitting the levels that they required for the expectancy that they have as a football club, but I don't think he did necessarily a bad job. And a lot of the things he put in place and a lot of the players who he brought in or worked with necessarily have now formed quite a key part of Tuchel's operation as well. And he I think I remember in the summer, he didn't want to claim any credit for them going on and winning the Champions League, but ultimately Tuchel has inherited a pretty sound platform within which to add the elements that he's added. So credit to Frank Lampard. So I think it is a good fit from Frank's point of view. And we all hope from Norwich's point of view as well. That's the acid test, isn't it?
Yeah, I was reading the official statement that Chelsea put out when they appointed Frank Lampard, and it was interesting that one of their directors described him as one of the brightest young coaches in England. Obviously, you'd imagine they would have done that irrespective of who he was, but that's an interesting point. With Petr Cech, we've carried some quotes from him today, talking about how he's a student of the game, etc. I guess a lot of questions now, Pad, will turn towards, well, what if Norwich City do get relegated? Is Frank Lampard going to be a man who's committed to dropping back down into the Championship with them? Before we come to Dave with the comments, in terms of his contract, is that going to be interesting to see how that's structured and how many years Norwich City decide to give him? Or do you think he will be, irrespective of what happens this season, the Norwich City head coach, whatever division they find themselves in, come next August or so?
I would think so. I would think those, again, massive asterisks, it's not confirmed yet, but those types of conversations would have been clearly, something Stuart would have sat down with him and his representatives, and that as much as it is clearly the whole focus of this now is to stay in the Premier League, but you also have to think about the what if scenario, and yes, if you want to portray that scenario, and come May of next year they're back in the Championship, I'm pretty sure, given that he was happy to start in the Championship and do what he did at Derby, that he would have given assurances that he feels, if that is the way it plays out, that he would still be there. And why wouldn't he? Because ultimately, talked to somebody about this yesterday. You look at how Bournemouth, okay, they needed a season to recalibrate, and Scott Parker's gone there now, and they look like they're running away with that division. But Fulham are maybe a better example. And even Norwich and Farke went down, kept their better players, maybe had to sort of go out on a limb with the Buendias and say, give us another season, max, give us another season in the Championship, but primarily retain the squad. And the financial muscle they had vis-a-vis, a lot of the other Championship clubs, because of the parachute money and the Premier League revenue, all those advantages, because we know financially they're in a fairly healthy state, even having navigated through a pandemic and the impact on matchday revenue. But if Norwich are back in the Championship next season under Frank Lampard, they will have, if not the best squad, certainly in the top two, and they will have the financial power to go again next summer in that and then the January window. So nothing is ever a given, but if I was Frank Lampard and I'm thinking, okay, yeah, I back myself to keep these in the division, but if I don't, he knows he's going to be in charge of a club who are pretty well geared up to come back again. And I wouldn't dispute that. I would think, well, does he want another season in the Championship on his CV? No, but in a strange way, if that scenario panned out, he might find that's an environment where you would think with a fair win, Norwich would be winning most games every week, and he might develop again as a coach, and that when he and whatever squad he had come back to the Premier League, they're better positioned. And ultimately, this is what this whole Stuart Webber template is about: is that ideally they stick and that they're a top 17 club moving forward. That is now the aim. But if they don't, they drop out, and they're geared up both financially and as a squad and the coaching staff to have a proper crack at coming straight back. And they managed it before under Daniel and Stuart. So I think there would be nothing to fear for me if they did go down that they couldn't under Lampard and Stuart Webber. And worth reiterating, yet to be confirmed, but he is staying beyond next season, so he will be there in the Championship. And as a result, I would be pretty confident, without lapsing into sort of dismissing what the Championship has to offer nowadays, that Norwich would come back at the first attempt. And if they did, then 18 months from now, Frank Lampard is back in the Premier League, isn't he? So, but at a club where he's really been backed, and really by that stage, if that came to pass, really been able to embed his philosophy and his coaching ideas on a group of players. But of course, any minute he does have any relative success, then you do fear that other clubs will then, because it is Frank Lampard, come knocking. But ultimately, if that was to happen, the same with Buendia, Godfrey, Maddison. If those players are being coveted, they've done well for Norwich. So why wouldn't that apply to the head coach position as well?
Absolutely that. Dave, I can see we've had loads and loads of comments come through. Keep them coming. Just give us a little bit of a flavour of what people are making of these reports that Frank Lampard could be the next Norwich City head coach.
Yeah, and I'll just follow on from what Pad was saying earlier. I almost feel in the situation that people shouldn't worry too much about the long-term element of it. Just worry about this season. If it comes to next summer and it hasn't worked out and Lampard wants to go his separate ways and they bring in someone new, fine. If he's up for the Championship, great. I just think that people should just keep it short term at the moment. It's all about getting those wins, getting that momentum. Mixed, I think. If you look at Twitter, there's a very mixed reaction. I'm a little bit surprised. I didn't realise before this last few days really that there was much of an anti-Lampard sentiment out there. I mean, I always thought.
Do you think? Sorry, just to pick up on that. Do you think if we were talking about Ketil Knudsen or someone who's a bit more unknown, do you think that would be in many ways seen as a more positive step? Is it because of Frank Lampard's? We talk about his reputation there. Is there a fear that amongst some Norwich fans that could actually work against him before he's taken this job?
Maybe it's sort of an anti-Chelsea sort of feeling almost, because they're resented almost as one of the billionaire big boys who just sort of bought their way to the top. And Lampard wasn't a huge part of that. He was was he one of the earlier? No, he was in before Abramovich, wasn't he? Because they bought him for sort of 10 million from West Ham, if I'm remembering that correctly, and that was late 90s, something like that, maybe 2000, something along those lines. But yeah, he's done his football punditry and he is high profile, but he's always come across to me as someone who seems pretty grounded, pretty. He's a good talker, isn't he? He's very professional. He's quite erudite in the way he presents himself, and I'm a little bit surprised that there's been quite so much negativity. I'm not quite sure where it comes from, really. Maybe it's just the fact that, what was it I said on the pod, that 15 games as player and manager against Norwich and he's never lost. So maybe those wounds cut deep over the years. Jordan H. Cook says, reeks of little club syndrome, no more qualified than Daniel. Give him that Chelsea squad. He'd have done just as good. Not sure I agree with that. I think with the top clubs, quite often that the profile buys the manager a lot with those top players. But we all know that Daniel's good with his tactics as well. One thing I think while you were talking there as well, thinking that maybe, obviously this is led by Stuart Webber. We all know that he's the man that runs the football side of the club. But maybe the board do deserve a little bit of praise here. We'll see how it works out. But they sat on their hands for Chris Hughton, didn't they? It was around this time of year when they got smashed 7-0 by Manchester City, and a lot of supporters were saying, you got to make the change now, you got to make the change now. They didn't. They ended up losing that game to West Brom, didn't they, with 6 games to go, and Neil Adams took over with basically no hope left. So we'll see if it works out. What else have we got? There's quite a few. Jordan Cook says as well, still, at least TalkSport will be happy. They won't be able to, maybe Stuart is really, really sick of all that. So, well, I mean, he said it to you a bit in the interviews, didn't he, Pad, the other week, that he really didn't like the way that they'd been treated and thought it was all pretty unfair. Craig Brown, bringing in Lampard shows the club means business. I'm sure his style of football will be entertaining to watch. Lampard will probably want Norwich to play attacking football. Don't know if it's my assumption that's correct, but players who played football as midfielders that then go into management generally like their teams to play attacking football. I think that this is quite funny. Jonathan Parker, love the fact one of my best mates who's an Ipswich fan has Lampard on the back of one of his England shirts.
Well, he was trying to think when it was now. He was interviewed for the Ipswich job, wasn't he? I seem to remember a while ago. Was it before Paul Hurst arrived? I'm pretty sure Frank Lampard, I think Harry Redknapp said, was interviewed for that job. So that's something that we might have to have a little look into. And I suppose as well, there'll probably be plenty of talk about the Carrow Road floodlights over the next week or so, I would imagine.
Yeah, there's got to be some good jokes in there somewhere. Jamie Mann, this is a clear sign of ambition from Norwich and showing a clear change in the club's mentality. Frank would be a brilliant appointment, and that's what we have to keep saying. That's not done and dusted yet, is it? Neil Luther, backroom appointments will be interesting. Do you see John Terry coming in too? Don't think so. He left Villa with the intention of getting his first managerial job, didn't he? So, and you know, we've been talking about all the names recently, haven't we? And I don't think anyone that's got any controversy in their past attached to them that Norwich are going to ever get on board with that. You know, for instance, Wayne Rooney is actually doing quite a good job at Derby, isn't he? But I couldn't see Delia and Michael ever signing off on Wayne Rooney being the manager, because he comes with quite a bit of baggage, doesn't he? But yeah, I think that probably gives you. Well, hopefully we can avoid this at least. I'll make this the final one for now. Adrian Buck, change of club name from Norwich City Football Club to Frank Lampard's Norwich. Hopefully that won't be the case quite as much, because it wasn't at Chelsea, was it? And I think it was at Derby when he was seen as a coup, and he was still so fresh from his playing days and stuff, wasn't he? So, yeah, let's hope that they can avoid that. We'll certainly be avoiding it, won't we?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. We certainly won't be using that. Pad, let's come back to you then. Brave from Norwich City, is that probably the best way to sum up this appointment? For all that we're talking about Frank Lampard from a reputational perspective, it's still somewhat of a leap into the unknown. There are lots of people still in football who don't really feel they truly know what Frank Lampard is as a coach. And I mean, I kind of asked you earlier maybe what he would find attractive about this job. You mentioned security, the chance, I suppose, to develop his style and prove himself as a coach. But from Norwich's perspective, this is still brave, isn't it? I suppose that's probably the word we'd use.
Oh, it's bold. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I mean, this is almost a breakout moment. Whether it'll prove to be, with hindsight, the right call. I mean, there's a lot of people saying that, Stuart Webers' legacy could hinge on this appointment. Probably a little bit too strong for me, but I can see where they're coming from. And, it's a long way from an unknown, with the greatest respect to Mr. Farke, manager from a German second-tier side, albeit Borussia Dortmund second-tier side. But, this, in fact, could you get further removed from, an unknown commodity to, well, depending on where you feel he places, but certainly in the modern era, one of England's best midfielders. His record stands comparison, what he won at Chelsea. And also, what I like, I think we might have discussed this on the pod or one of the other pieces of content we did recently, but, you compare him with Gerrard and Scholes, the two sort of peers of his generation in that England midfield. He wasn't as talented as those two, nowhere near naturally talented. But any anecdote you've ever heard about him, he just worked in his work ethic and his professionalism just to make the best of whatever talent he had comes through. And that is underlined by his achievements in the game. So if he had those qualities already instilled in him as a person, then you can be sure he'll have those as a coach. And that they're not bad traits, to be working with. That, he will give absolutely everything he's got. Because ultimately now, I think the last thing I would say is, it has been portrayed that he bombed at Chelsea ultimately, that he was dismissed. He didn't go on his terms. He was deemed maybe not good enough. And if you're Frank Lampard, that's probably first time in your career where you've been questioned that, are you good enough? Have you got enough about you? Because certainly nobody as a player would ever have questioned him when he moved on from West Ham, definitely, what he went on to achieve. So there will be now people, and I'm sure he's well aware of this, who are questioning, is he good enough? Is he up to the job? Well, given that, whenever that was put to him as a player, he responded and he showed by his actions that he was good enough. I'd like to think we'll now see a renewed, motivated, hungry, young head coach coming through the door and desperate to prove that, whatever he was as a player, he can maybe be that as a coach. So I think it's a very bold appointment from Norwich, but also an exciting one because, as I say, we've managed to talk for 45 minutes here and it's like flown by. So I don't think it's going to be a dull, and it certainly won't be Norwich last on match of the day for the foreseeable, I'm pretty sure they'll be getting pushed up the pecking order. And whether that's a good or a bad thing, that raised profile, I don't know. But certainly everybody knows now that Norwich are in this to have a good crack at it. And yeah, let's get it on. I can't wait now for Southampton a week tomorrow.
That's the headline.
I'm not going to be there, which is slightly gutting after this, but there we go. Dave, just to come back to you, we've seen Steven Gerrard get announced today as Aston Villa's manager. We could go into the obvious jokes about them two not really fitting next to each other or whatever, but on a serious point, are Norwich in a better position because they're getting Frank Lampard after Chelsea, and so that talk is not going to exist, is it? It's not going to be about Frank Lampard taking the Norwich job with a view to then the leapfrog or the jump, I suppose, back to Chelsea. Whereas with Gerrard, it's all going to be about that, isn't it, Aston Villa? It's going to be about the pathway to Liverpool and replacing Jurgen Klopp and all that. Is that a kind of a bonus of picking up Lampard when they are sort of where they are, I suppose, and where he is in his career as well?
Yeah, it's a good point. He's going to be hungry to prove himself, isn't he? Because people are doubting him. There's no point. There's no avoiding it, because as we just talked about in this video, he arrives here with the jury very much still out. That, you know, he did manage to get Chelsea into fourth, wasn't it, in his first season? And then they did make the knockout stages of the Champions League in that season, but then things drifted off, didn't they? And some of the signings that they made didn't work out. Timo Werner, I think, is probably the headline one, isn't it? Although Lampard wasn't solely in charge of transfers, was he? They obviously have a sort of football committee and their equivalent of a sporting director, whatever it's called. I think it's managing director. I think they call it at Chelsea, don't they? But yeah, I think that could work out as a good thing. He arrives at Norwich with very much a point to prove, with a lot of people doubting him, even Chelsea fans. You know, he is Mr. Chelsea pretty much, maybe, you know, alongside perhaps John Terry and a few others, but he is a real club legend, recent club legend. You would have thought that there's basically nothing that Frank Lampard could do or say that would turn Chelsea fans against him, but plenty of them wanted him to step away by the end and just said that it'd come too early for him and that it hadn't been a success. So yeah, if he ever wants to get back towards the upper echelons of the game, he needs to make success of this opportunity. If, as we sit here today, it does get confirmed in the days ahead, as it sounds like it will, yeah, you got to hope the Norwich benefit from that. And I think that almost not worry too much about that long-term thing, because I had mentioned a little bit earlier, if he does get poached by Leicester or whoever in a year or two's time, then that probably means that he's done a good job at Norwich. So strap in, and yeah, it's going to be an interesting ride.
I remember much of the similar talk around Patrick Vieira when he took the Crystal Palace job in the summer, and look at the start that he has made there. Very, very impressive indeed. So hopefully Lampard can make a similar impact. Just to bounce it back to you, Dave, who do you think will be, we've spoken about Billy Gilmour, so we could probably already park him as maybe a winner of this appointment. When we kind of talk about Frank Lampard and his immediate, if it is going to be him, what's his sort of in tray at Norwich City at the moment? Maybe in terms from the players' perspective, I guess we'd probably throw Todd Cantwell and Christos Solis maybe into that pile. Any more that you'd add on top of that?
Yeah, I don't think anyone would be surprised if Todd's in the squad, shall we say. Maybe he's not quite got a start in him at the moment because he's not been playing a lot of football, has he? But yeah, Gilmour is obviously going to be a big one. While you were talking earlier, I was just checking back, and mostly with Derby and Chelsea, he's played a 4-2-3-1, hasn't he? 4-1-4-1, occasionally 4-3-3. Not similarly to Daniel, not really been wedded to three at the back, although he has played it occasionally. So I guess, again, that shows where there's some sort of logical steps in terms of him maybe being of a similar style to Farke and things like that, but they'll be hoping of another caliber. I think it's more than that as well sometimes, because you can't, the same as players really, you can't just judge it on what they're achieving. It's about the timing of it, isn't it? It's about momentum and things like that. And as we just spoke about a minute ago, about the fact that Lampard at the moment has got something to prove, isn't he? You know, Daniel Farke achieved a great deal, but he lost his momentum. Things got in a little bit of a mess, and it eventually went wrong for him. It doesn't mean that he's a bad coach. We're all expecting that he's going to pop up somewhere, aren't we? You know, he's even in the Rangers odds. He's a bit down them. It's 25-1, but none of us will be surprised if he gets a Bundesliga job in the next year or so, will we? So it's not like we're writing off Daniel Farke. It's just things ended up tipping in the wrong direction too far. So yeah, Gilmour's obviously a big one. The defense is probably going to come down to who's fit. That left back position, Williams probably laid down a marker during the Brentford game, didn't he? Rashica took a step forward. Where Dow might sit in things, I'm not 100% sure. He could maybe look to bring some of the loanees back in January. I'd be surprised to see anyone like Hugill or Dermich or Hernandez or anyone like that coming back into it. He's going to want to bring in a few bodies, you'd have thought, maybe change things a bit. But Webber will probably have to be honest with him from the start and say, look, we just signed, 9 new players, 11 total. We spent 60 million and potentially another 20 odd million to follow. So that at the AGM, at the financial briefing the other week, they suggested that if they wanted to spend money in January, they could free up funds, but we know they're not going to be spending another 60 million because that's just Norwich City logic, really, isn't it? But he clearly is probably going to want to do a few bits and pieces. But in terms of loans, it's already maxed out at the moment from the Premier League, isn't it? You've already got Williams and Gilmour, so it's not. I can't see him flooding the team with Chelsea players unless it's maybe somebody on the fringes, something like that.
Yeah, it's going to be absolutely fascinating to watch. Paddy, let's end with you then, because you're going to be the man who's going to be asking potentially again if Norwich City can get this over the line. Frank Lampard questions every week. So from a personal and I suppose a professional perspective, how exciting a prospect is that?
I'm too long in the tooth now, Connor. Yeah, I don't know. I'm more interested to see how he sort of drops him into kind of. We all know this is a special club in a special part of the world, and how much it means to so many people, and was that the case at Derby? I'm not sure. There's a lot of clubs in that neck of the woods. I'm sure, of course, there was passionate Derby fans, but it is almost a way of life around here. It is how I feel, having lived here for quite a long period of time, and will he get that? Daniel got that. He understood that. He understood what it meant to people, and yet you had to bring them on that journey. And sadly, up until the end, he did do that, and superbly as well. And if Lampard can galvanise, and obviously through people like us to connect to that fan base, and lift it up again and get everybody on the same page, and then for me, it's still all there for them in terms of what they can achieve this season. It's still going to be incredibly difficult, even if he can have a galvanising impact early on, because it's the Premier League and it's a brutal examination most weeks. But it just feels like it is quite a departure from appointing a coach like Daniel Farke, and Webber has. He certainly hasn't took the safe option, has he? Let's be honest. There's probably other coaches out there who could have held the ring and maybe been far less profile than the profile that Frank Lampard will bring. So, he's gone bold, and Lampard himself, because, he may have looked at it and could see that maybe Norwich isn't as an attractive option as a Villa. I'm not saying that he was ever in the frame for Villa, but, he might have, if he'd have sat around long enough, got an opportunity at a club maybe more geared up, but he's gone for it as well. So he's shown a degree of boldness as well. So, as Dave said, we've got to just strap in now, and I don't think it's going to be dull, that's for sure, for these next sort of weeks and months, because, ultimately something had to change, and it's almost like we've had a bit of shock treatment now, subject to this being confirmed over the next days and hours, and then it's how we go from here. Ultimately, more of the same was not going to get the job done, and this very much is not more of the same. This is a brave new era about to unfold at Norwich City.
Absolutely, strap in, everyone. This is going to be quite something, I would suggest, to watch at Norwich City. Frank Lampard reports suggesting he is on the cusp of being announced as Norwich City's new head coach. We're expecting an announcement probably at the back end of this weekend. Maybe pushed into Monday, but we shall see. Pinkin.com, of course, the place to go for any latest developments. We will bring them to you as they happen. It's going to be fascinating as we get edge closer to that appointment now. Thank you all very much for watching. Continue to let us know what you think of this potential appointment. Thank you for all your comments as well. Been good to kind of read some of them as we've been going. Frank Lampard's Norwich City. Let's see what happens in the weeks to come. Thanks for watching. See you soon.